The PRovoke podcast, brought to you by PRovoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.
Hello everyone, I'm Maja Pawinska and I'm the EMEA editor of PRovoke, and I'm here in a very sunny and weirdly quiet London today with the chief, Arun Sudhaman, down the line in Hong Kong with an update for us about what's going on in the city. Hello Arun, how are you doing today?
Hi Maja, I'm good. Not sunny here, quite wet, a bit dreary, but interesting times as always for Hong Kong. I think every time we talk on this podcast, it's like something new and crazy is happening.
What's going on at the moment? What's the mood like?
The mood is, I wouldn't say it's great. On the one hand, we seem to have done very well here in terms of handling the pandemic. The local transmission of the cases is really under control. We've had almost a month now of kind of 0 cases a day.
Amazing.
So that's good. Of course, you don't want to tempt fate because no one knows what's going to happen. And we've already had a second wave, so there could well be a third wave. But things are starting to get back to normal. My kids are going back to school next week for the first time since January. So that's amazing. And I'm looking forward to that, even if they're not. So that's all good.
Yeah.
But aside from that, of course, you know, there's all the political things going on, which we've talked about before. And the last few weeks have really, I think while the world's attention maybe has been focused quite rightly on the pandemic, while that's been going on, you know, Beijing has definitely stepped up the crackdown in Hong Kong. There's been a lot of things happening in terms of pro-democracy figures being arrested, people being disqualified, moves in the local legislative council, you know, to try and crack down on pro-democracy politicians. Things that affect the media. There's been, you know, Hong Kong's most famous satirical show has been cancelled.
Oh wow!
Because of a whole 3,000 complaints, which I mean that's like an off day for the BBC. But that was enough for the show to be cancelled, for the government to demand a full apology, and for many people to start writing obituaries of RTHK, which is Hong Kong's equivalent to the BBC.
Oh wow!
So you take all these things together, and it's not a great picture. The anniversary of the protests starting, which is 12th of June, 1-year anniversary is coming, and then there's lots of anniversaries this summer. So it's going to be a long and hot summer, and there's going to be a lot of unrest, I think, out on the streets.
Yeah, I can't believe it's a year.
I know. It's not even a year, actually.
Yeah.
It's not even a year. That's what makes it so crazy. And in a year, we've had both our most dramatic and tumultuous political crisis and also a global pandemic.
Yeah, interesting times for Hong Kong in particular. So we're getting this background. There's apparently more than 2 stories in town, and the government's again on the hunt for a PR agency after kind of failing to find some support last year, as you exclusively revealed a few days ago. So tell us what's going on.
Yeah, so 3 weeks ago, 15th of May, we reported that. Sorry, no, it wasn't 15th of May. It was. Gosh, I'm already confused because as you know, there's been so many stories on this going back to last September, and it's been kind of a whirlwind. So at the end of April, we reported that the government had restarted its search for a global PR firm. I think most of our listeners will be aware they tried this last September. They invited 8 PR agencies. And ultimately all 8 turned them down. They started this again at the end of April. Quite a big difference this time around, in that last year's brief was very political, very much focused on winning domestic support for their policies, which, you know, you can file under the impossible brief, I would suggest. This time around, it's much more about restoring Hong Kong's reputation as a global business hub, which is, you know, critically important. Hong Kong is nothing if not global business hub. And it is very internationally focused, very economically focused. I thought there would be more interest this time around from agencies because one, it's more economic, it's more distanced from politics, it's more international, so it's more distanced from all of the domestic unrest. And of course, there is a pandemic, which I imagine is focusing agency minds more on the bottom line, maybe at the expense of other considerations. But having said all that, the deadline for proposals expired last Friday, and turns out that not many big PR firms actually took part. So Edelman, of course, is the big one, and of course they're the biggest firm in the world. They are taking part. Other than that, pretty much all of the big PR firms have chosen to steer clear of the brief again. Certainly, if we're talking about top 20, 25, top 30 PR firms in the world. Another exception to that was MSL. Now, this was an interesting one. MSL, we reported, had decided to go in as a supporting partner to their firm, to their sister agency, Corvus. Now, I don't know if you're familiar at all with Corvus, Maja?
No, I haven't come across them actually. That was the first time in the story that I'd kind of become aware of them. Yeah,
so I visited Corvus once years ago. They are best known. They're a DC firm. I think they only have an office in DC. They are best known for their relationship with the Saudi Arabian government, and they have a long relationship with Saudi Arabia, and they have honestly attracted a lot of controversy for that relationship. Anyway, they needed a Hong Kong partner because you can't take part in this brief without a Hong Kong office.
Was that different last time as well?
Yes, the threshold is different. So last time, it's actually lower this time, the threshold. So that's another important difference. So thanks actually for pointing that out. Last time you needed like offices in different countries. You actually needed quite a big, I think you needed quite a big presence in Hong Kong. This time, all you need is 2 staff in Hong Kong and 1 office in either North America and Europe.
Okay, this is a bit wider. Do they have to be? Is there a date before which this office in Hong Kong needs to be set up, or could you effectively set up an office to enter the brief?
I think I'm not sure. I didn't. There may be some language around that in the brief, but I think you need to have 2 full-time PR professionals employed by the office.
Right.
And I think, given the time between the tender and the proposal date, it would have been very hard to actually set it up that quickly and to get hire 2 people for it. But the threshold, as you've kind of pointed out, is very low. It really is, a lot of people can take part. Some suggestion that firms have tried to partner, so maybe an independent in the US will find a like-minded independent in Hong Kong. It's unclear if that's allowed under the criteria. But anyway, Corvus can partner with MSL because they're part of the same company. So that's fine. But MSL had second thoughts after we reported that Edelman and MSL had entered the brief. We also reported that a Singaporean firm called Red Hill is taking part. Another firm that we think might be taking part, we don't know for sure, is one you will be familiar with, Crosby Textor.
Yes.
Which is, run by Linton Crosby, of course, of I think Brexit fame.
Of Brexit fame. No stranger to controversial briefs.
Exactly. Now, we must be clear here. We don't know for sure if they're taking part, but we do know that they attended the briefing session. We also know that Linton Crosby came to Hong Kong last year, gave an interview in which he laid out I thought some reasonably sensible advice on what the government should do. Basically, they should listen to their critics and take on board what they're saying. We also know that Crosby Textor launched in Hong Kong last year and now has two staff. So that's kind of interesting.
Yes. Did they write the brief themselves?
No, I would never suggest that, and we are definitely not suggesting that at all. Interestingly, if you look at the firms that attended the briefing session, it really is a who's who of big PR networks, and we reported on this BCW, Ogilvy, Ruder Finn, Fleischman Hillard, I think Ketchum, they were all in the briefing. They all decided
Yeah.
not to take part. MSL, of course, did. APCO, that's another one, decided not to take part. MSL did, but then they had second thoughts over the weekend. So we reported the story on Friday. Over the weekend, I don't know how to describe it. I mean, it is quite localized, but I have never seen my phone blow up to this extent.
Really?
No, and as much as I've kind of always wanted to go viral, and I think as a journalist, especially, I think as a trade journalist, you don't really have those moments where you get that kind of, that the thousands of retweets. I didn't enjoy it very much, and neither did MSL, because by Monday they had decided they were going to withdraw from the process. Their staff were not happy. The staff in Hong Kong, there's a lot of. I mean, if you look at the social media stuff that's out there, a lot of it is pretty tough. There's a lot of comparing these firms to Nazi atrocities. There's a lot of swastikas in my timeline.
Oh gosh.
It's really intense. Now, it's difficult to say how real all of this is. I think I would probably suggest something like 90% of it is online only. It's not pleasant. And there are risks, there are risks to agency reputation, clearly. And MSL has decided to pull out. So we reported that on Tuesday. That got even more attention because I think the protest movement saw that as a victory. And so they kind of maybe even gave them a license to step up their attacks on Edelman and Red Hill. Meanwhile, the Hong Kong government on Sunday, quite strange because the Hong Kong government, I mean, these days doesn't do much anyway, but certainly doesn't do much on a Sunday, and came out with a statement on Sunday after no commenting me on the Friday, realized it had to say something, came out and said that they'd had 7 bids. Of course, that's now 6, given that MSL is out. I don't see how Corvus can continue, although they may try, I imagine. So 6 bids, let's say. Let's say we know maybe 3 of them. That leaves 3 others. But honestly, it's kind of it's not really clear whether those bids will have met the criteria. They could be local firms with maybe an overseas office. Could be ad agencies, maybe research firms. Maybe some firms have tried to partner up and go for it. So that's kind of where we are now. I mean, we know a few of the firms involved. They're getting a lot of flack on social media. It's a big story in Hong Kong, but the news media are so fast moving here. There are so many big stories here. Every day something quite big and significant happens. So that will die down, and that will help the firms that are taking part, I think. I think Edelman is going to stay the course.
Do you?
I think so. I think they've got a very good chance of winning it, honestly. And I think, we have reported on the budget that is available for Hong Kong's Information Services Department, which is running this brief. Now, obviously, that's not the budget for this particular 1-year campaign, but the overall budget for this department was increased by 53%.
Wow.
In Hong Kong's most recent budget. So you would imagine there's 8 figures available. Sorry, you would imagine there's 7 figures available. There's not 8 figures available.
I mean, I would go for it if there were 8 figures, frankly.
Yeah, well, with the threshold, maybe we could. Who knows?
Well, people are always writing to us assuming we're a PR agency.
I know,
go for it.
They are. Yeah, we get all sorts of RFP invitations. Actually,
seriously, let's do this.
Yeah, so that's where we are, and it's been really intense. I mean, I can only imagine what how the firms going through it are feeling. It must be tough. Must be tough on their staff. But equally, they knew what they were getting into. I think there's this caveat emptor here, right? They all knew, I think, what was going to happen.
I'm interested in the gap, though, right? Because it's the gap between the number of agencies who are interested enough to attend the briefing and go along to that stage, and then immediately get cold feet to the extent they're not going to go for it. And then, it sounds like Corvus MSL is probably not going to be the last of those 7 to pull out or to not even meet the criteria. Why is it such a controversial brief? What would give you pause other than the fact that it's very hot under that spotlight in Hong Kong at the moment?
The reasons are varied, but they're not too dissimilar from the situation last year. And I think the question probably is, has enough changed between last year's brief and this year's one? And we've run through some of the ways the brief is different. And we've run through a couple of the ways that the environment is different, most notably because PR firms are under, I think, much more difficult economic conditions.
Yeah.
But many of the PR agency heads I've spoken to don't think enough has changed. They don't think that the message the Hong Kong government is trying to push out can really be divorced from the reality of what's happening on the ground here. They don't think that this economic development brief can be neatly separated from the political reality of what's happening here. If you're trying to sell Hong Kong as an economic story, any self-respecting journalist in the US or in Europe or in these target markets is going to ask about the protests. And then the question becomes, well, how are you going to answer that question? Are you going to give them a factual response, or are you going to have to maybe give the kind of response that the government is happy with? And I think many agencies would rather avoid that situation. Now, having said that, I think many agencies attended the briefing because they genuinely want to see if they can help this situation. I think there is an opportunity for a PR firm to help, but only if the government is willing to listen, and only if the brief is serious. I mean, even this brief, there were sections in there that, frankly, were really worrying. There was a section in there about how, the social unrest is because last year the government didn't make its case well enough in terms of mobilizing support for law enforcement. And, this idea that the government's big problem is they didn't make the case well enough for law enforcement. I mean, it's just really tone deaf. And the idea that might be part of this campaign, I think, would give agencies pause. There was another section where the brief asks agencies to consider how disturbances would impact the campaign communications and tone of messaging. And I know one very experienced public affairs agency that chose not to bid because of that paragraph alone, because they said it could be used to justify, justify a crackdown.
Yeah.
So it's too sensitive from that respect. There's the usual employee activism angle now, which are all very familiar with. Local staff will have concerns about it. We've seen that with MSL. I think that's probably the case with other firms too. I think ultimately the Hong Kong government needs a PR firm more than a PR firm needs the Hong Kong government right now. So you have to look at that balance. It's the impact on the reputation of the firm involved is an issue. But also, I think we have to say that there are firms that did want to take part, and I think decided against it for really prosaic reasons. They were too busy. They had too much on. And I believe them, actually. I don't think they're necessarily making that up. I do think maybe it's a case of, they're busy and maybe this is more hard work than it's worth.
Do you think there's there's more focus in the last couple of years probably on ethics in global public relations and these sorts of briefs, which obviously, as we all know, led to the downfall of Bell Pottinger? And do you think that's more of a consideration for firms these days? Whether this is something that they, is in line with their values as a firm, not just because of local staff worries, but it's like, you know, how do we want to be seen as an agency? What do we stand for? Do you think that's a consideration, or are you still cynical about that?
No, absolutely, it's a consideration. I'm not cynical about it. I've always thought that's a consideration, but I think the reason you suggest I'm cynical is because I think it's a pragmatic consideration, in that firms have seen what happened to Bell Pottinger when they took on a brief like this, and they're really aware of what the penalties are and the consequences are, right? And so it's just not worth the potential downside, I think. I think the Bell Pottinger example has made them far more aware of this and has raised the stakes, no question. But, you know, let's be clear, every agency out there, as we know, is happily accepting work from the Saudi Arabian government right now, as we speak.
Yeah. That was actually going to be my next point. How is Hong Kong different to doing work for Saudi, which everybody seems quite happy to do?
I don't know.
Huge amount of cash flowing around, which is probably part of the reason. But I don't understand what the difference is.
I don't know. I don't have all the answers. Neither do you, I assume. And it's such a complex situation. It's why I always feel this argument around everyone deserves representation is just a total red herring, because, you know, in a court of law, there are clear laws that prescribe how the different parties behave and act, and the whole guidelines and the process and all of that. You don't have that in the court of public opinion. There are so many gray areas in terms of who gets represented, how they get represented, what arguments can you put forward, how far can you push an argument, how far can you spin it, where is the line? And so I do think it really is a case-by-case thing. And honestly, I do think, and maybe this is cynical, I do think that weighing into that is the fact that agencies don't get as much grief for representing Saudi Arabia as they will do right now for representing Hong Kong. The other factor I didn't mention is that the geopolitical stakes are higher now. I think China is far more, in a geopolitical sense, far more toxic than it was 7 or 8 months ago. And so that's not going to play well either. So I do think, you know, whether you call it ethical or pragmatic, I actually don't necessarily see a huge difference. Ultimately, I think it's agencies looking at something and just kind of making a determination on the upside and the downside. One of those determinations is, are we comfortable doing this? Is our staff comfortable doing this? Is this the kind of work we want to be seen doing?
What do you think is going to happen next?
It's a good question, because it seems like everyone stopped talking to me now, and I can't imagine why. I think, well, certainly according to the brief, there are supposed to be presentations, supposed to be this week and next week. So they have to determine which of the bids meet the criteria. Those that meet criteria, the criteria then, I think, are invited to present, and then a decision is made. And so we should get to a decision reasonably quickly, because they want the campaign to begin in, I think it's June/July. I mean, there is a timeline, but as you all know with these things, it's a movable feast.
Always. So you think that ultimately Hong Kong will be successful this time around in finding an agency?
Yeah, I'd be very surprised if they're not. And I think that at this point, the government needs to find an agency. I don't think they can go through this whole rigmarole and then end up empty-handed again. It's just it's really a bad look.
Yeah, it's not a good look, is it? That happening twice, and it does sound like the brief is different enough to kind of to justify going for it with that. I wonder how easy it's going to be though to really separate out, as you were saying earlier, the politics from the presentation. It's
really hard, and I've been talking to so many people about this, and the range of views is fascinating. Honestly, you know, the full spectrum from no, I wouldn't touch it. Obviously, it's just a no-brainer. To, on the other end, yeah, of course, it's economic development. Every firm does economic development for dictatorships. Let's be clear. And Hong Kong is not even a dictatorship, right?
No, this is true.
let's be clear, there are much worse governments out there that right now are employing well-regarded PR firms to do economic development. And we don't need to name them, but they are out there right now. And those firms have chosen not to work with Hong Kong, right? So it's hard to say it's a moral or ethical decision. But what I would probably say is this brief, the gray area is a lot bigger.
Right.
And that's a bit depressing. But maybe that's what it comes down to. Is there enough wiggle room?
Yeah, and also, I mean, the fact that it's quite a discreet brief, isn't it? It's a short period of time. It's a 1-year project, effectively, rather than we are Hong Kong's PR agency forever and a day. So maybe that's going to make things easier if you can kind of frame it in that way.
Yeah, although I've had other people suggest, within a year, what exactly are you going to accomplish apart from banking the money? The other thing probably worth noting is there's been a lot of trade union activity in Hong Kong over the last year. A lot of trade unions have sprung up here as a means of supporting the struggle. And there is a PR trade union now, a PR employee union.
Is there really?
Yeah, and they launched in January of this year, and they have come out quite stridently against this brief. They've said to agencies, to think twice, basically, before taking this on, because there's going to be a lot of stuff going on this summer. Now, this union, I think they say they have more than 100 members from 30 firms in Hong Kong.
Right, okay. That's most of Hong Kong's PR agencies, I'm guessing.
I mean, as in any market, there's a huge long tail. But if you're talking firms of more than like 10, 15 people, there's not that many of them. So, I mean, it's hard to say how influential that group is. Certainly from a media perspective, they've been quite active. And they've been quite successful at getting into the local media. So it's quite fascinating to see it playing out. I've not seen this happen with certainly any story I've reported on. Because you don't really see this kind of PR angle become the story. I think the last time I saw it happen probably was News Corp, weirdly enough. When they hired Edelman, funnily enough.
So there's a pattern here. And you're right in the eye of the storm as well. So you're not just observing it as I am and we are over here in London. You're right in the middle of it. So you've got all the kind of that you understand the nuances of the market and what's at stake much more than anybody who is reporting it from a different standpoint. You're right in the middle of it, which is kind of, like you said, it's kind of weird working for a trade publication and having that spotlight on you.
It is very strange. It's been kind of shared by all the politicians and all that kind of stuff. It's never happened. It doesn't happen when you write a story about a new EVP of purpose at an agency.
No, this is true.
So that's been quite surprising, a little bit unnerving, but ultimately you can't be upset about these things. The one thing I will say is there's always value to distance. I think distance does bring perspective. My concern is always that I'm too invested, and that maybe I'm seeing things too up close, and someone with distance will maybe you kind of notice things that I'm missing. So I'll rely on you for that.
I'll let you know. I'll let you know if I think you've missed anything. Right. Well, I must go and write my next story about the new EVP of Purpose. Agency that isn't bidding for the Hong Kong
That's the
work.
kind of story I want to go back to, actually. Just
Oh, yeah. Be careful what you wish for.
Yes, indeed.
Well, look, take care of yourself.
All right, thanks.
I know you'll keep us updated, and we'll see how this plays out.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Maya.
Take care and see you soon.
Take care.
You've been listening to the PRovoke podcast, brought to you by PRovoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.